Good morning. Well, hello. It's a pleasure to be here finally. I've been interacting with Kepa and Heidi and others through COVID. It's great to be here in person. I want to start with, I don't know if it's a confession, but I prefer interaction to just talking to people, like at them as a presentation. So please, not only do you have my permission to interrupt, I encourage you to, if anything is not clear. It's a much better way of, doing scholarly work, I think, to have interaction. So, yeah. So I'm just going to start with just a little bit my background, and then I'll get to the meat of the talk after that. That's the short version of my CV. Started with a maths degree and then did other things. Taught English in Bolivia. I learned a little bit of Spanish, but that was 20 years ago now, so it's gone down, but maybe it will improve. Yeah, and then research fellowships in a few different departments, which on the one hand is I've really enjoyed the diversity of perspectives that I've been exposed to and engaged with people with lots of different backgrounds. On the other hand, interdisciplinarity is a challenge in, I think, contemporary scientific environments, career challenge, publishing challenging, and so on. But it's, I found it hugely rewarding. I'm probably best known for a book that I published in 2015 about the evolutionary origins of communication. And I've worked mostly on communication from an evolutionary and cognitive point of view, but a few other themes too. And increasingly, I feel that my main focus is, although languages and communication are a quintessential perfect example, the general theme is that I'm interested in the evolutionary and cognitive foundations of social phenomena. So as I say, language is a quintessential example. There are many more, democracies, dancing, the list is endless. And in fact, I gave a talk online, some of you were there, last year, and I talked about diversity in human expression and communication. Those of you who were there will recognize this image, or I hope you will, if you remember it. The paper that talk was based on has recently been accepted, so this is now Behavioral and Brain Sciences. I don't know if you've seen the call for commentaries, but the deadline is next week, so you still have time to submit a proposal for doing a commentary on the new paper. And this is in some ways an enrichment and an update of what is in that 2015 book. I'm still proud of that book, but I've realized over time there are some shortcomings that can be improved, and working with Christoph has really allowed me to do that. So one thing I talked about in the talk last year was, if you take this very diverse perspective on communication, this really isn't just languages, communication expression, I should say, all sorts of things that humans do. And I gave the example in that talk last year of teaching is one thing that humans do. And when they teach, they use language, of course, but they do many other things. They exaggerate their body movements. They change the angle that they're standing to make certain things salient, to raise the manifestness of certain things, and so on and so forth. So one thing that one can do from this perspective, from a research, going forward with the research, is to look again at the teaching literature from cognitive and evolutionary perspectives, and actually the ethnographic literature on teaching, which is extremely rich and diverse, and reanalyze and rethink the nature of teaching from that perspective. That's something I'm definitely interested in doing. It's something that I put into my ICABASC application. But you can also look at languages from this very diverse perspective, seeing languages as one special case, albeit one of obviously massive importance for human social life, but nevertheless a special case of a general capacity for communication. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so to start with that, I'm going to use this figure here. This figure I found on Wikimedia, and it has the label Levels of Analysis in Linguistic Structure. I'm assuming that everybody here was familiar with the basic idea that's sort of suggested by this image, so that you have a core in the middle of what linguistics is, discrete units, and we can analyze them in all sorts of ways, from the smallest ones, the phonemes, the speech sounds, up to the next level, the phonemes, and you go through the levels of morphology and syntax to whole sentences. You get something called literal meaning, and I will talk more about that later. And then only at the outside, meaning in the context of discourse, actual interaction only hits the analysis of languages on the outer edge. And I'm using, I was drawn to this figure because I think it's a pretty good, it's not just a description of levels of analysis of languages, it's a good description of levels of bureaucracy in linguistics departments, which is to say that real linguistics is all this stuff, right? There's kinda linguistics, yeah. But it's also a bit anthropology, it's a bit cognitive science, and you're not really a linguist if that's where your main attention is. I've kind of been told that in more or less the same words at different points in my career. I think this picture is mistaken. I think it's more accurate to think of the structure of the nature, I should say, languages, something much more like this. And this is in many ways the headline point that I made in that 2015 book. Humans have a distinctive capacity for a type of communication, they have a capacity for a type of communication that is, in my view, distinctive in the natural world, described in some detail by Dan Sperber, Deirdre Wilson, and others in the relevance theory tradition. You can describe it in other ways, more classically neo-Gricean ways, if you wanted to. I've been much persuaded by the relevance theory arguments. And that allows you to do all sorts of things. In particular, it allows you to generate the constituent parts, the linguistic items that linguists tend to focus on. And so to broaden that point and kind of complete the circle of this opening, I see ostensive communication as the very distinctive thing that humans do. Obviously, a massively important case of ostensive communication is languages, but so too are many other things that humans do. And I think this, the evolution of this capacity here in humans is the foundation of a great many things that are distinctive about human societies, human culture, human behavior. So that's where I've kind of come from, so to speak. The work I've done thinking about the evolution of human distinctiveness drew me to this conclusion, essentially. And it's from that perspective that so I attended during lockdown a very interesting set of online seminars. I don't know if any of you saw promotional material for this, the Birmingham lectures. They took place a year ago, February and March last year. The focus was in that second line at the top, language structure and language use. So on the one hand, a collective phenomenon, language structure, as a social and collective phenomenon. On the other hand, an individual or interactive phenomenon, so individuals interacting in the context of language use. And I take the question to be, well, how does that individual interaction generate that broad social and collective phenomenon, right? It's a question about cognition and culture, about the links between the design of the mind and the nature of society. And they had talks from 5 rather influential names within linguistics who have published on these issues. And they all attended each other's, and there was an ongoing conversation over the course of several weeks. And I attended this very much from the perspective of thinking about languages as a special case of ostensive communication. And through that, I came to realize that, realize is too strong, I came to entertain the idea that there may be very important unifying links between, on the one hand, the tradition I've come from, namely relevance theory, and on the other hand, a tradition in linguistics classically presented as an alternative to Chomskyan generative grammar, but may not need to be, and I'll come back to that later, on the other side, so that's construction grammar. So the essential idea here that I've been thinking about in recent months is that these two very, very influential ideas may be natural bedfellows. I spoke recently to Dan Sperber about this idea. Dan is one of the pioneers of relevance theory. And I've spoken in the past to Robin Carson and Deirdre Wilson, just in general. And what I've come to realize is, given the time and the context in which they developed their ideas, they were very much influenced by the Chomskyan tradition, the generative grammar tradition, which has many fantastic insights that have taken us forward in many ways. But maybe it's possible that they've not been quite alert to the rise in the last 2 decades of construction grammar, and the fact that there may indeed be many very productive points of contact here. to oversimplify the issue a bit, but to put it, in a pithy and concise way, on the one hand, you might have a theory of meaning, and on the other hand, a theory of grammar, and that it may be possible to unite the two. And that I find to be a very exciting idea. So relevance theory describes the foundations of human communication and expression, and construction grammar describes how those foundations are exploited in all sorts of rich and interesting ways. And a research idea in philosophy or theoretical cognitive science, is that together these two ideas can provide motivated perspectives on a great many issues in language science, not just the classic issues in debates about language learning and generative grammar and so on, but all sorts of issues, the nature of similarity and difference in languages. I don't have examples to mind right now. I'm thinking about language acquisition, which I've just mentioned. There will be more. I will come to them later. I have a long list on a file on this computer, but I'm not going to get hold of it now just to finish that sentence. I will come back to it later. So the idea is that, by unifying these two ideas, you may be able to develop motivated perspectives on a great many issues. And I'm going to sketch in the rest of this talk how these two ideas might be unified together. Before I do, a word on what I think the nature of this project is, maybe from a philosophical perspective, if that's the right word. Consilience is a great idea, somewhat contested word, I think, in some quarters. I take it just to be the idea that all science makes idealizations. It has to. If you're not making idealizations, you can't make progress. You have to say, that's not our domain. That's for the people in the building next door. I think the commitment you have to make if you're serious about crossing disciplines and doing interdisciplinary work, you have to make the commitment to developing idealizations that are coherent, not just to you, but to the people you're handing the question to, right? So I might say, as a linguist, I'm going to make assumptions about, the cognitive science of communication. They don't have to be exactly right. I don't have to know the detail. That's not the point. I do have to say to the people who do study cognitive science of communication, my question is something like this. And if they come back and say, that is a terrible question from where we're standing, then something's gone wrong in the dialogue. And there's important philosophical work in trying to make adjustments on each side to make, to achieve consilience. Right? It's not just whether you think it's a good idealization, it's whether the people you're handing the question to think it's a good idealization. I think this is a very important part of science. And I think it's somewhat discouraged in the present incentive structure of academia, which is extremely specialized. And I take this project that I'm sketching today to be a project of this sort, attempting to link those 5 inner layers with the further out layer. Okay, so I encouraged interaction earlier, but nobody's done it yet. This is a good point for me to pause, because in a moment I'm going to sketch a few, the headline points of relevance and construction grammar. So this is a good point to take clarifications. No? Okay. Okay, so, yeah. So, central idea of relevance theory. Humans have a distinctive capacity of mind for ostensive communication, more precisely the expression and recognition of a type of intentions. So when we communicate, we don't just put the content, that's itself a difficult word, but let me use it for now. We don't just put the content out there in the world. What we put out there in the world is our intention, that you understand the content. That's a Gricean insight, essentially. And it's, well, I think some people in this room know far more of the detail of Grice than I do, but you put the intentions out there, and on the basis of recognizing those intentions, the audience is able to recover the meaning. Grice is by means of clause. Terribly important for comprehension. Relevance theory is very much inspired by Paul Grice's work, but makes 2 main departures. First, rather than maxims of conversation, which are heuristics or guides to how to interpret, there is a single, I don't want to call it a guiding principle because that's the wrong idea. It's a spontaneous assumption. So, and the way I've started to think about this is akin to what happens when you see an object in the world. If you perceive an object, then the way you process it effectively makes spontaneous assumptions about its nature, that it's physically bonded, that it can't be acted on at a distance, and so on and so forth. And these have been, in the case of objects, Liz Spelke in Harvard has made her career in pinpointing these assumptions that are there from the very, very earliest months of life. Right? You perceive an object in the world, you make assumptions about the nature of that object. The claim of relevance theory is that when you see ostensive behavior in the world, and if anybody wants, I can say more about what ostensive means, but I'll leave it just as an intuitive idea for now. When you see ostensive behavior, you make spontaneous assumptions, unconscious, that behavior is the most relevant one that the speaker could have produced given their goals and abilities and preferences and the constraints acting on them. And it's that single spontaneous assumption that allows the audience to converge on the intended meaning. And then the second main departure is to insist that in linguistic communication, it's not just the implicit side that is very much subject to contextual inference, but it's the explicit side too. So almost every word is subject to enrichment and contextual effects. And it's not the case that you have something, there's literal meaning, and that can be, identified, packaged up, and then that might be enriched implicitly. But actually, both sides of that story are very much subject to contextual inference, and I will talk more about that very shortly. In fact, I say very shortly, I think it's the next slide. So, yeah. So an example. This is from a paper of Deirdre Wilson's. Peter suggests that he and Mary pay a visit to his aunt in hospital, and Mary replies, "I have a temperature," right? Meaning, I don't think we should go, right? Now, the key thing here is that the concept that's being alluded to with the word temperature is not the concept temperature that, might be taken to be its literal meaning, so to speak. Actually, this is badly written because, I'm conflating the concept and the word here, so this sentence is not quite right. But I'm sure you can see the idea. This word here is referring to a concept that is not just any temperature, because I have a temperature. Of course you do, you are a living human being, you have a temperature, right? The concept that's being referred to is a temperature high enough to preclude going to the hospital today. Right? So how do you converge on that concept? Either temperature, the word, is decoded in a conventional way, it's rejected because that would be trivial, and then it's enriched in some way by conversational maxims. Well, this would be the neo-Gricean approach, Gricean or neo-Gricean approach. The alternative approach that relevance theory has developed is that the word temperature is enriched in the process of comprehension. So actually, in the live interpretation of that sentence, this sound, the sound that is produced, is taken to map on immediately to the concept temperature. And the concept temperature high enough to preclude going to the hospital, the concept temperature qua temperature is never actually entertained. To be more detailed, there are two questions that essentially the cognitive process is asking about the ostensive behavior, the linguistic behavior in this case. On the one hand, what is it that the communicator wants me to believe? What are they trying to do to my mind? Right? They are trying to do something to my mind. What is that? And then there are, how are these items that they're producing, these sounds that they're producing, actually being used here and now? I've seen these things before. I've heard these sounds before, right? How are they being used here and now? And the relevance theory claim is that these two processes are it's called mutual adjustment in the literature. The answers to these two questions are being mutually adjusted in the process of comprehension, live, and the output, when they've been adjusted sufficiently that they begin to mesh with one another, more precisely when expectations of relevance have been met by this process, then there's a single output, namely That's what they mean. They mean, let's not go to the hospital. This idea is developed in detail in a number of papers in the relevance theory tradition, Robin Carsten, Deirdre Wilson in particular. I think that a lot of the neuroscientific evidence points very much in this direction too. I'm not intimately familiar with the details, but when I read the conclusions and the review articles, what I read is something very similar to what's been described in this literature. Yes?
When you say, what does the communicator want me to believe? I mean, this can be as a result of understanding. I mean, it can be like open or manifest intentions, ostensibly would be the word maybe. I mean, ostensibly or covertly, right? You can suspend it. She wants me to believe something.
Yeah.
You know, she was too cheap or she was too.
So you're completely yes. You're completely right. This is a this is a folk way of putting the question. This is not a formal statement. To make it more formal, you're quite right. Sometimes I intend you to believe something that I'm not making manifest. I'm not making overtly manifest, right? So a more precise way would be something like what is being made overtly intentional, right? Which intentions are being made overtly manifest. There may be covert ones, of course there might, yeah. Okay, so that's where relevance theory is coming from. And I'm going to come back to this figure later on when I talk after I've talked a bit about construction grammar. I'm going to move on now to construction grammar, which I'm less versed in, but I feel I know the basics. The essential claim is that grammar is constituted in its entirety by learned pairings between, on the one hand, a form, and on the other hand, something that's in a lot of papers and books called a meaning. Sometimes the word function is used instead, and that's going to be quite important very shortly. These pairings can exist at all levels of linguistic analysis. So most obviously, there are words, aardvark and zebra, but then there you can go down into the details of different levels of linguistic analysis. You can have the morphemes, and you can go up to whole phrasal, expressions and idioms. What's this bag doing on the table? This was a famous example analyzed in a very influential paper at the beginning of developing the idea of construction grammar. This was the main example they used to motivate the idea that you can analyze grammar in its entirety in these terms here. Yes, go.
In this case, the forms, words will be in a form, morphemes will be forms, idioms will be
Yes, exactly, yeah. Yes, absolutely, yes. So I'm trying to capture everything with just three words here, abstract grammatical rules. It could be, island effects, anaphoric one, all sorts of linguistic phenomena that have been described. All the things that were in that figure I pointed to earlier, that's the claim of construction grammar, that all of it can be productively analyzed in terms of pairings between form and meaning, for want of a better word for now. But I'm going to be more precise about that word in a moment. Yeah. These constructions, these pairings, are learned via use, and for that reason there is a close link in the literature between, on the one hand, analyses of grammar from a construction grammar perspective, and then usage-based approaches to languages and language acquisition. So Mike Tomasello, Joan Bybee are very influential researchers in this tradition. In my early career, during my PhD work, I published a paper, the signaling signalhood paper, which I have some slides on, and I can come to it later if there's time. But I find I didn't know this at the time. Actually, I was a PhD researcher. Something like this is going to be interesting, and over time, I've come to realize that it really isolates down the process of how use can generate pairings between form and meaning. Okay, and this is just an image from those Birmingham lectures I attended. This is a talk by Adele Goldberg, and she's in many ways the most senior figure at the moment, active figure. She's at Princeton. doing work in the construction grammar tradition. And she was talking in this particular talk about how using construction grammar to analyze one particular phenomenon, which is linguistic interest, which is that over time in English, we used to say uncle and aunt, and also pa and ma, father and mother. And now over time, we say aunt and uncle, we say mummy and daddy, we say grandmother and grandfather. And you see it across all these different types. So it's X and Y, where X is, one of those is male, one is female. They come in pairs as individuals. And you see these all shifting at a similar time in American English, and she's analyzing that from a construction grammar perspective. Millions of interesting linguistic phenomena can be to be analyzed in the world. This is but one example. Okay, so those are the essential ideas. Now, I'm going to sketch how one might enrich construction grammar in a way that can make it consilient with relevance theory. And then I will come to relevance theory and suggest some enrichments to relevance theory that go in the other direction, hopefully aiming at consilience. Okay, so this is the claim, pairings between form and meaning. But what is this meaning, right? It's a word being used largely in a everyday folk kind of idea. How does it relate to notions that have been developed in much more detail within pragmatics and the philosophy of language? So my proposal is that we can recharacterize constructions as more precisely conventional pairings between form on the one hand and then functional contribution to making manifest an informative intention. Those of you who are familiar with relevance theory, these words are discussed in painful detail in the relevance theory literature, and we can discuss them if necessary. The point is, this is the goal in communication, is making manifest informative intentions, is actually the point that Kepper just pressed me on. That's more precise characterization than what I gave. That can be done in many different ways. It can be done just by moving my body, as I talked about earlier. It can be done in all sorts of ways. One way is by making use of conventional pairings between, making use of conventions, full stop. And these conventions having been developed culturally to serve this function. So let me say more about that now. I'm going to say more about conventions right now. So conventions in general, I take this to be, a conclusion of the very large philosophical literature on conventions, commonly known solutions to recurrent coordination problems. There are many coordination problems in human social life. Famous examples, crossing the road, which side of the road should cars drive down, and so on and so forth. One recurrent, excuse me, I've lost that, so commonly known solutions. So recurrent coordination problems, commonly known, right? We all know, and we all know that we all know, and you get common knowledge about the solutions. One recurrent coordination problem in human social life. It's going on right now as you listen to what I'm saying and you're trying to infer what I mean. One common coordination problem is convergence on speaker meaning. I want you to understand what I mean, and you want, I hope, to understand what I mean, right? So we have a coordination problem. This can be resolved, this coordination problem, in non-conventional ways all the time. It can be ad hoc behaviors that we might produce. If I go to some faraway place in an alien culture, I know nobody, I know none of the local behaviors and norms and so on. I don't know the language. Well, the only thing I have really is ad hoc behavior, to ask directions and try and get things done, find somewhere to sleep and so on. So there are certainly non-conventional ways to solve coordination problems, but there are also many, many conventional ways, right? And they needn't be linguistic. So we point, we nod, we do all sorts of things we use thumbs up, right? All sorts of things which are conventional but not linguistic. I would like to call all of these conventions constructions. They are pairings between a form and a functional contribution to making manifest an informative intention. What these ones don't have is a linguistic quality, right? So, but they are pairings between form and functional contribution to making manifest an informative intention. But of course, some of these constructions are networked together in very rich structured sets, right? It's not just that languages are not just lists of individual items, as linguists have long emphasized from Saussure onwards. They're networked together in very rich structures, and we can, in fact, so detailed that there's a great deal of debate about how best to describe those structures. And we call those networks or structures languages. So what I'm saying is that the etiology of constructions is as conventions and, or but, I don't know whether to say but or and, they can be used not just in their conventional way, their literal meaning way, but also in unconventional way. And that's how we get creative use of language, such as in metaphor. People understand when you use a creative new metaphor, a new interesting way of phrasing your point that sort of breaks the rules of grammar. People understand that that's the convention and you're using it in an unconventional way. And that may indeed be the best way to achieve your communicative goals, to making manifest your informative intention. And I think, there's a lot of detail here to be fleshed out. You can see that I'm describing something at quite a high level here in terms of, so a lot of the detail is not in focus here. I'm sketching the landscape. So there's a lot of work to be done. But I hope you can see the general idea that with this notion of, very general notion of convention and a tweak in the way that constructions are characterized, you can start to make construction grammar a theory of grammar, consilient with relevance theory, a theory of meaning. We turn now to back to relevance. I'm going to point to one suggestion for, it's not strictly speaking, not an enrichment, but actually a change in a core part of relevance theory. It's a small change, but I think an important one for the goals that I have in mind. So, following a great deal of research in semantics and pragmatics, philosophy of language, relevance theory maintains a distinction between the implicit and the explicit. They characterize those two phenomena in particular ways, and to do that, they develop these notions of an implicature and an explicature. Nevertheless, they do maintain some sort of a distinction there. And I never quite got it, if I'm honest. And for a long time, given that I was thinking about evolution and primate communication and those sorts of issues, is not so relevant. Now I'm starting to think about going back to languages, as it were, and to grammar. Starting to engage with this in a lot more detail. And I would like to suggest that actually implicit and explicit are not a binary, not a distinction. There's not a line. They're opposite ends of a continuum. This continuum is a continuum in the degree to which conventions, communicative conventions of the sort we've discussed, are used in their conventional ways. So linguistic constructions can be used in conventional ways. They can also be used in unconventional ways. And we call that creativity. Right? Sometimes they're used, and so when they're used in, really a whole sentence or utterance is comprised of conventional constructions used in their conventional way. We tend to call that explicit. Sometimes people use constructions which are new or, not widely used in the community, or they use existing constructions in highly unconventional ways, nevertheless achieving their communicative goals, and we tend to call that sort of thing implicit. I'm going to characterize the extreme endpoints in a moment, and that will flesh out the idea a bit more. But before I do that, I want to go back. In fact, no, but to do that, to characterize the extreme ends and therefore to flesh out this continuum a bit more, I'm going to go back to this figure from earlier. This is the process of mutual adjustment. What is it that the communicator wants me, or excuse me, more precisely, what is it, what are the informative intentions that the communicator is attempting to make manifest? That's the more precise characterization, the capacities on the one side, and then how are these particular linguistic items, you can read that now as constructions, being used. There are cases where there's no input from this side of the equation. There could potentially be, but there are cases where there are no constructions being used. And I gave that example earlier of pantomime in an alien culture. Right? There are, I think, also cases of the opposite, where just this side But they're not the cases that we often think of as, literal meaning or, some propositional meaning or various concepts. The extreme case is advanced mathematics. Right? So in the case of mathematics, you have a mathematical expression. The constructions that are being used have been developed over time by a specialized community to be extremely precise in the functional contribution they are making making towards making manifest an informative intention. I think that's right. The evolution of mathematics is the evolution of ever more precision in the nature of that construction. And so then within the relevant community, you can have really quite, extremely complex ideas expressed extremely precisely. And when that's the case, then it's just the constructions that are being used. The whole point of this is to ensure that this is playing no role. The whole point of evolving mathematical expressions is to ensure that this stuff here is playing no role and it's just these. And that's how mathematics becomes so precise and so successful as a description of all sorts of scientific phenomena. So I take those to be the sorts of things that appear right at the extremes of the continuum I have in mind. Culturally evolved mathematical expressions at one end, pantomime and alien culture at the other end, all sorts of cases of implicit, communication that we do every day. We are all competent sort of here in everyday interaction. Sometimes we're very precise with our words, sometimes we are open-ended, sometimes deliberately open-ended and moving around here. Quite commonly, even within one utterance, we produce constructions, some constructions that are here, some that are here, some that are here. We're using constructions in all sorts of different ways. And I think the human ability to be able to do that, to navigate across this continuum, the figure has gone, but to navigate across that continuum, both as communicators and as audiences, is extremely distinctive. It's distinctive of our species, and as I said earlier, I think it's the foundations of a great deal of what is distinctive, of societies, culture, and so on. Okay, so to summarize all that, really there's just 3 bullet points here, really zooming out just to the research agenda. My focus over time, my focus over time has been to think about evolutionary and cognitive foundations of human social phenomena. Languages are clearly, quintessential, wonderful example. Not in the long term, for me, an exclusive focus, but clearly one, as I say, of very interesting and huge importance. I think there's a big project here to develop these ideas in much more detail. As I said, what I've tried to provide here is a high level, this is the landscape. A lot more work needs to be done zooming in to develop it, but I feel quite good about it right now, but this is the first time I presented it in person. A few colleagues have seen some documents I've developed, but it's the first time I presented it. So it's very much evolving work in the direction I want to go in. I have more slides on that signaling signalhood study I mentioned earlier. It's some experimental work from much earlier in my career, but it's very relevant to these issues, and we'll show you more about the sort of work I've done. But equally, I don't have to present that at all. We have 15 minutes, and it might well be better if you have questions and we do some actual interaction.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So, time for questions, comments, discussion. Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. When you explained the first time, the idea that there is one of the extremes of the continuum, the implicit one. In one of the last layers or slides, you put no aspect of expression of that one. Not aspect of expression.
Excuse me, yes, I put those labels there and I didn't mention them. I'm sorry, that's an oversight.
No,
yes.
Conventional. And I thought at the beginning that I understood the idea, but now it's like, can it be no conventional at all?
Maybe not. That's an empirical question. I take that to be an empirical question. Right. If there, it's possible to conceive of the extreme. Yeah, I conceive of the extreme. Does it exist in reality? That's a very good question. I don't have any particular view.
Yeah, no, because I was thinking, because, I don't know, in order to get information, I am doing some pantomime to a person in Mars, let's say that way,
right.
Someone in Mars. But in order for him to extract information about what I am doing, he has to be I don't know how to explain it. So when I do this for eating, to do this for eating,
right.
There is no convention there?
This is a convention, no?
Yes, that's pantom.
Well, it's conventional. Surely, I mean, I take the word pantomime to mean non-conventional body movements. Okay. Right? It's not like it's not like I have a theory of pantomime or anything like that. I'm just using it to capture the idea. Yeah.
A scenario where me, without doing anything conventional, trying to communicate something.
You've played the game charades, presumably.
Under that name,
well, yeah, you must have played it, maybe not under that name. It's when you get like the title of a film, and you're not allowed to say anything. And you have to, and there are conventions even in that, right? In the UK at least, we do this for 2 syllables, for 3 syllables, this for a film, but you still have to act out the name of the film or the song or whatever it is, right? And some of that acting out is plainly not conventional, right? Yeah, but some of it is conventional, right? This means film, and that, yeah. So, yeah.
So we may forget about worrying about capacities. I mean, there is no real room for radical claiming under determination of translation. I mean, the examples that we imagine cannot be real, at least in the radical version. There must be some natural. I mean, if they are conventional, some natural communication that is universal.
What? So I take. So, well, I have not read the original for a very long time now, but as I understand it, so the idea is that there is an anthropologist in an alien culture, and a rabbit comes by, and the locals point at this rabbit and say, "Gavagai." And the question is, what does Gavagai mean? And Quine goes through in detail, showing that you might think it means rabbit, but it could, maybe not. And it could mean, undetached rabbit parts. It could mean dinner. It could mean all sorts of things, right? And I take that argument to mean that, I take that argument to be, a demonstration that the problem that people like Grice and then Sperber and Wilson are addressing is a very real and substantial one. Right? You cannot simply assume a code model of how linguistic communication works. So it's a fundamental question, and I take, as I say, Grice and others to be aiming to address it. And I think that the human capacity for ostensive communication, whose evolution I've attempted to describe, is how humans solve it. It's those fundamental capacities to express and recognize intentions are how you solve that problem. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a clarificatory question, I think. It's a matter of focus, I think. I don't get if you are talking about what kind of convention you are using as a speaker, or if you are, like, if it's related to the intention I have as a speaker, or if you are talking about different contents that different contents that can be explicature and implicatures in relevance theoretic terms. But can you have more than one explicature or not? Since you have this continuum, I just wanted to
Okay, so I will say a few things, and you can tell me if they address your question and so on. I am proposing to abandon the words explicature and implicature, and I'm proposing to accept words of this sort not as explanations, but as empirical phenomena that are in need of explanation. Right? It's true that as humans, as language users, we produce behaviors that collectively we might characterize as explicit or implicit or somewhere in between. That's what's in need of explanation. And I am suggesting that the way to explain that is in terms of conventions, and more precisely in the degree to which those conventions are actually used in their conventional way, because quite frequently we use them in unconventional ways, such as I have a temperature. Strictly speaking, that is an unconventional, only a little bit unconventional, but nevertheless unconventional use of the word temperature to some small degree. Does that answer your question?
Kind of.
Then.
Yeah, so then, for example, the thing that you were saying that in the very same utterance, you can have things that are more conventional than others, or
Yes.
it goes for all the levels? Like,
Yes. I mean, I'm doing this analysis on the fly now, but I think I have a temperature is pretty good because it's only 4 words, so it's relatively simple. It's got a very standard sentence construction, subject, verb, object. Yeah, that's right. Well, subject, verb, object. You know, it's using the words I and have. It's using the verb have in its conventional way. So it's not I has, but people do say that sometimes to be creative. It's using, and the word temperature is being used mostly in a conventional way, but not completely. Right? So, you know, it's a more or less explicit statement, but not entirely.
Yeah, but it's still, sorry, can I just follow up
Yeah.
in this case? Still,
There was another one, but
you are saying, there's still this distinction between the example and the description of the example you made, which from the one hand, the utterance, I have the temperature,
Yeah.
the meaning, and then the belief, the temperature, right? I shouldn't visit, I shouldn't go to the hospital. In the description, there are
Right.
two separate things that we assume to be there, so now it's
Right.
not there, right? Call them explicit, implicit, I don't care, but, and moreover, there are cases like those that can be quite conventional too, like the cases of indirect speech act, right? Can I have a cigarette means I'm asking you a cigarette, right? So
Yeah.
these are quite conventional, even still you have a distinction between direct and indirect speech act, but
Yeah.
so, well.
Yeah, so yeah, this is a good enrichment of the question. So 2 things to say, I think. The first is, yeah, you're quite right to point out that I need to distinguish between, on the one hand, the goals that the speaker has, the communicator has. Ultimately, those goals are to raise the manifestness of the idea that we should not go to the hospital, right? That's the goal. The question is then, how is that goal achieved? And my answer to Joanne's question is an answer to that question. How is it achieved? Well, it's achieved by the use of conventions in the service of ostensive communication, and those conventions are being used largely in a conventional way, but not entirely in that particular case. Now, as for unconventional uses of the speech act sort you gave, can I have, and so on. It's an empirical question whether, I'm going to go way back now. I take that to be an empirical question. Oh, I've gone too far back. Excuse me. Next slide, I think. No, this is the relevance theory. Sorry. I'm going to go here. Here we are, right. I take it to be an empirical question whether the best analysis of cases like that is to take them item by item as, an ordinary sentence which is processed as individual. Are the constructions that are processed, can, I, have, and so on? Or are they more of this sort? Right? There's already a convention about how to do a thing of a certain type, and you fill in the parts, right? Those are different constructional analyses of the same phenomenon. I don't have any commitment in advance of a particular example about how to do that, I take it to be an empirical question.
I think Joanna has a short
Oh,
follow-up.
sorry, that's not Joanna. I got my names wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the question is related to Joanna's and maybe to Kepa's also. So I think I'm quite sympathetic with the idea of continuum and to explain some things. I have to think more about that. But then I was thinking about, is it not useful, like theoretically, when we are reconstructing communication, to have this division between explicit and implicit speech acts, or however you want to call it? And especially, I was thinking of irony, for example. So is it true that the speaker meaning or the meaning that you want to convey or whatever you want to call it is very implicitly communicated in irony? But if you try to explain how irony works or how someone communicates ironically, you should be able to explain that there was a explicitly conventionally coded meaning or something. I don't know if I'm articulating clearly enough this, but you should be, you have to understand what the speaker has explicitly, apparently, in order to understand.
I would prefer apparently, yeah.
Yeah, apparently, yeah. And I believe that when you are comparing what is conventionally communicated and whatnot, it's just, we are talking just about the conventional meaning of words or phrases, because there are conventions about irony. So we know how to be ironic. Yeah. So, but then what is not conventional? So if ironically communicated meaning is not conventional, and the speech acts are conventional, all these ways are conventional. So which are the examples?
Yeah. So I think I have two things to say. One very. So the first is what the first thing you said was about, don't we want to keep hold of something like explicitness in terms of, I don't know if you used the word explain, but I took it to mean that you were explaining the world. I'm not sure we need those notions to explain, to describe the world. So what is the empirical phenomena? What are the empirical phenomena in the world we want to explain? It's very useful to carve it up in all sorts of ways, depending on our particular goals. And it's plainly the case that there are very interesting phenomena in human language use. Irony is a classic example. That it's worth saying, well, that is really quite different to all these sorts of things, right? So in terms of describing, there's a whole rich array of things, and we can taxonomize them in different ways. And I'm not suggesting just put them all in the same box, right? What I am saying is you can put them in that box. I think you can explain that box and that one and that one and that one with the same set of tools, right? Deirdre Wilson has, both Dan and Deirdre, but particularly Deirdre, have written a number of papers on explaining irony. The echoic account, I'm sure you know about it. I don't see, in fact, no, not only do I not see that there's any contradiction between what they offer in that echoic account, where they say on the one hand you mean that, but you're also raising the manifestness of the explicit, apparently explicit idea, and you're making a commentary on that explicit idea. That's your real, informative intention. Not only do I not see a contradiction between that account and what I'm suggesting, I'm just having this thought, but it seems very plausible to me that what I've presented can enrich that echoic account of irony. That's the direction I would go in terms of irony, yeah.
I think I have a sort of chicken and egg question, So going back to the Gricean notion of expressing intentions, right? Taking the speaker to be saying what they're saying because they're expressing an intention. We have, of course, the problem that in order to make psychological attributions, we often rely on language and in order to figure out what their intention is in the first place, but in order to figure out what they're saying, we have to already be ascribing a particular intention. Right? And so I wonder whether you can say more about how seriously, how you take the Gricean intention work, right? Because one way you can do it is you can think, well, okay, so a general description of background conditions that are operative in communication, right? Or you can think of it as a psychologically real process that's taking place online in the situation, right? And just moving on to a field where I'm a little bit more knowledgeable, right? Folk psychological communication or folk psychological understanding. There's been a big move over the last decade or so, right? From thinking, oh, well, when we are understanding or engaging with other people, we have to actually online ascribe beliefs and desires and so forth and so on, right? In order to plan blah, 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 towards an account where it's no, there are much simpler mechanisms in play, right? So there is no elaborate description of the beliefs or desires in that situation, but those types of descriptions come into play when we're puzzled, when something doesn't work right or we don't understand right. So I'm just curious about how you think of that as a sort of attitude to you know, the Gricean intention, you know, in sort of online, I guess, versus as a big background.
Yes, it's a very good question. I think I have certainly two, maybe three things to say. First one's general, and then I'll be more specific. Maybe I am not aligned with the recent moves you're suggesting, in the sense that I'm a mind-reading deflationist. So I do think that attention attribution is going on all the time in human interaction. But I think one of the words you used was elaborate. I don't think it's elaborate. I think it's a background fact of how we process the social world. That
Can I just ask
yes,
to that? And
yeah.
so do you mean that, okay, intentional descriptions are going on all the time, insofar as we're thinking people are doing in general things for attention, for certain reasons, that is, there are certain intentions behind them, or are we just assuming, so, you know, at an abstract level, you're doing things, you're saying things for a reason, there's intention there, in general.
Yes.
I don't know what it is,
Yes.
but there, or is it, I know the particular intention with which
Oh, no, the latter is the question that the observer or audience might entertain or they might not entertain. I think, so to zoom out, and I think this should get to your question, all sorts of things are perceptually available to me right now. Only a subset of them can I pay attention to. Those things are not just, you know, sounds and colors and so on, but people are behaving, and, you know, I might focus my attention. This is not the ideal example because everybody's doing the same thing, which is looking at me, but sometimes people are looking at computers and so on and so forth, right? Their intention is there for me to compute if I want, you know, if my attentional system says that's going to be relevant, then I might then rapidly, unconsciously, spontaneously compute that they have an intention to, you know, read their email or whatever. But I don't typically go through that process, just as I don't typically, you know, if I'm looking at you, I don't typically pay attention. It's available, but it's not necessarily computed. And it's the attentional system that is directing what is being computed and so on. I don't think other people's intentions in this respect are any different to, you know, the colors and the sounds that are around me. I think humans are extremely finely tuned to being alert to the potential relevance of others' behavior. Am I getting to your themes?
I mean, I don't want to. No, I mean, I don't really know whether it does, right? Because then it seems to me that you're describing your intentional system as opposed to you're talking about what their intentions might be, right? So, I mean, in the sort of language case, right, you have the problem is, okay, I can understand or interpret or parse what the other person is saying only insofar as I see it as an expression of an anterior intention, right? And so the worry here is, well, aren't there online simpler ways, quicker ways of doing that, given how fast this works? Because I mean, certainly when it comes to interpretation of action, right, to see what somebody's doing, there's a lot of psychology that now suggests not only does it happen so quickly that it's not engaging the part of the brain that really is engaged in the more elaborate reasoning about others, where you can really say, oh yeah, we're thinking about their beliefs and their desires, which are the two fundamental building blocks of the contention. But also there are often subparsings of it, right, where people intuitively see, as it were, breaks in the behavior as being sub-behaviors, right? And all this happens like way too fast. So the question is just like, well, in the linguistic situation, would you be open to that kind of, as it were, online interpretation of what happens in human communication, even though you might say at an abstract level, the way that we understand what is going on as a sort of general background, the way that we describe the situation. Yeah, we're talking about attention.
Yeah, I think, so this is a great conversation. I think I suspect, although I'm not sure, that we're using the word like intention slightly differently, and it will take we'll have to, I think it would be very productive to flesh that out. Let me just say something, a general point about communication, which I think will contribute to that. So about communication and attention. So things can gain attention, or people, excuse me, more precisely, people can begin to attend to phenomena in the world in 3 different ways, as a rough taxonomy. So first, the attention can be directed from outside, which is to say, there's a loud bang, there's a bright light, there is something that, given the nature of attentional systems, immediately it causes us to immediately direct a great deal of our attention in a particular. It might fade very quickly, right? Distraction, back to it. So that's kind of top down. You can be bottom up. So my internal systems, for whatever reason, can decide I'm gonna, this is where I'm focused. I want to be attending here. I'm gonna keep that out. I think ostension is ostension comes from the side, and it's very distinctive of humans. So ostension comes in from the side, and it says, this is worth your attention. This is the best thing I could do to get your attention, given the goals that I have. So I want you to believe it's a particular thing. I want you to believe that I have, to be more precise, I have a communicative intention, that you believe that you accept my informative intention. By being ostensive, we say, this is worth you paying attention to, and the audience, for their part, makes spontaneous presumptions of relevance that I described by analogy to objects. They just assume this is the most relevant thing that person could have done, given their goals. And given that assumption, then their attention is directed towards uncovering the informative intention. So that general account seems to me, well, is a very deflationary way of thinking about intentions or informative intentions in particular. So I think, they're all over the place, and we are extremely adept at picking up on them. But I don't think that is elaborate or, needs a simpler explanation, because it's already simple given the way that humans are adapted, their cognitive apparatus works. I should say, there are people in the communication literature pushing at a line which I think is probably similar to what you're going at. So Celia Hayes, Richard Moore, Bart Gertz, a few others. That's why I say it's a great conversation, because I think it's live. I think it's important. And I guess those people are going to put in some commentaries on our paper, so we'll see the detailed case very shortly. Yeah.
Super short one. So then you think there are different kinds of intentions, speakers that we have. So the sense they want to communicate and so on and so forth. And you think there are a whole set of different intentions going on there?
So I think ostensive communication is characterized, but by definition, ostensive communication is the expression of an informative intention, and that's done by means of a communicative intention. So those things are constitutive of communication. humans' more broad social intentions, well, obviously they can come in, you can call them all social intentions if you want, but they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and flavors. And that, I'm sure there's lots of different ways of describing that. Yeah.
Well, this is a general comment about the dialectics between intention versus convention, which recently in philosophy there have been at least a couple of books. One like the Four and Stone can be early the Four and
Okay.
Stone. It's metaphor and convention and creative, blah blah in the title. I don't remember. And the other one by Michael David.
Bye.
This is about Michael David.
Okay.
Again about convention, linguistic convention and blah blah. And both projects, they see themselves attacking contextualist theories of language, or Gricean,
Yes.
Relevance theory.
Yeah.
Because they see, in some way, like Heidi was mentioning,
Yeah.
that these theories put too much power into attention to the role of the speaker's intention, the role of the speaker's recognition in communicative acts, in single communicative acts. And they offer as an alternative this notion of convention, right? You don't need to infer, you don't need to read other people's mind. It's just a matter of convention that makes the word. So that's how they focus. So I was just wondering, well, you better be careful. Maybe some relevance theory will say, oh, this is a fifth column and this is attacking us from within. Because he's putting, this in terms of conventional pairs instead of, recognition, intention, or so. Just, I don't understand on that. What would you?
I'm doing this because I'm trying to think of the things I want to say, and I know there's three, but only two of them are clear in my mind right now. So I'll go with the two that are. So yeah, I'm suggesting that conventions. Yeah, okay. No, I've got the three things. I'm suggesting that conventions are not an alternative to the expression and recognition of informative intentions. I'm suggesting that communicative conventions are used in the service of expressing and recognizing informative intentions. They're a tool, not an alternative. The second thing to say is that, I don't know the details of those accounts, but I suspect they're going to run into Gavagai type problems. The massive, extremely, exquisite context sensitivity of human communication, and the fact, it is all radically underdetermined. If you lean on conventions, misunderstanding should be far more common than it actually is. The third thing to say, and this ties back to Heidi's questions, in the new paper we were pressed on these issues by a reviewer, so there is a footnote, a short footnote. It's a slightly flippant reply, I admit, but these lines of arguments that, you're putting too much in, too many intentions, it's too complicated, too much mind reading. My co-author Christoph found, because he knows a lot about the history of mathematics, and science, he found a quote by Berkeley on Descartes. So Descartes proposes binocular vision. How does vision work? And he's got this, these computations of two different light sources, and those are integrated in a computational perspective. And Berkeley says, this is preposterous. This is far too complicated. It's far too enriched. It's about attributing too much. You have to be expert in optics to understand all of this. That is not what ordinary people do when they see things, right? I feel this conversation is similar. Like, I understand that analytically when I write it down, it's complicated, and why, the details of relevance theory and getting the informative intentions, communicative intentions, everything aligned, it's complicated. Vision science is also complicated, right? Just because it's complicated for us as scientists, that doesn't mean that the phenomenology has to be complicated. The phenomenology of vision and of communication is that it's a trivial task. And I don't see the tension between the complex description and the phenomenological easiness. And that's maybe when I said I'm deflationist about mind reading, that's what I have in mind.
Well, I do think it's important that some of the objection isn't just phenomenological, right? It's actually computational time, right? How fast people make these discernments, right? So it's also just
Right.
that.
Yeah. So on that, if it's the case that people process something like convention or explicit explicatures or literal meaning, something like that, and then sometimes enrich it with social cognitive inferences about what's implied, then it should be the case that metaphor and other non-literal or non-explicit uses of language should be slower to process and should be more prone to error than supposedly more literal uses. There is no psycholinguistic evidence to that effect that those things are slower and more prone to error. Metaphors used competently are, in fact, many people don't even recognize that things are metaphors until you point it out to them. So I think,
But
yeah.
you also have the data from people with autism, right? On metaphors and theory of mind.
Oh, right.
People with autism,
Yeah.
right, because they have problems with metaphors, they also have
Yeah.
characteristically problems with theory of mind, right? So that's another kind of.
Absolutely. Autism is, autism is, so,
Johanna knows everything about autism.
okay, yeah. So I think that the question from autism is very good. I don't have a developed answer. Frankly, I think, the older ideas that, those on the autism spectrum don't do mind reading, I think that can't be right. That's far too simple. What a better picture looks like is frankly unclear to me, and I think it's a good question. And I think, when I said develops motivated perspectives on all sorts of issues in language science, in the back, on that document that I mentioned is special language impairment and autism, but it's not developed in detail. Yeah. It's a good question.
There's a group right here in Victoria working on.
Right, okay.
Maybe we can leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.